Hey everyone, and welcome to Brent's Notepad, where ideas become insight. I'm Brent Shelton, inviting you to think deeper, lead better, and live more intentionally. In each episode, I dive into big questions and meaningful ideas drawn from books, research, and real life. In today's episode, we're unpacking Chapter 6 of Exploring Leadership, the second edition, written by Richard Bolden, Jonathan Gosling, and Beverley Hawkins. In this chapter, the authors continue to examine organizational perspectives of leadership by unpacking the complex relationship between leadership, power, and politics. In doing so, they discuss where power comes from, how it gains legitimacy, and how it quietly shapes behavior and can sometimes turn toxic in the hands of destructive leaders. So let's dig in. The authors begin Chapter 6 by pointing out that while leadership is notoriously hard to define, there's one common thread running through almost every definition. Leadership is tied to power. But that raises a big question. What exactly do we mean by power? Well, at its core, power is the ability to get someone to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. And here, the authors point us to French and Raven, 1959, who describes 5 sources of power. The first is reward power, which can be demonstrated through incentives for reaching sales goals. The second is coercive power, which can be demonstrated through disciplinary actions for poor or inappropriate behavior. The third is legitimate power, which is embodied through the ranking structure, as seen in the military. The fourth is expert power, which is demonstrated through those who are considered experts on a particular topic, tending to take the lead on a particular task. And fifth is referent power, where leaders embody the qualities in which followers aspire to have. Now, French and Raven's 5 sources of power are generally grouped into 2 camps. The first camp is positional power, where reward, coercive, and legitimate sources of power live. These are typically only accessible to someone who is the holder of a specific and formal managerial role. Whereas the second camp, personal power, where expert and reference sources of power live, these are accessible to anyone. However, they must be perceived as imbued with specific characteristics. Think back to our conversation on charismatic leadership. And what's fascinating about power is that it's not just about forcing people to act. In fact, harnessing one's power only works when others see it as legitimate. And this is where the authors tap in the idea of authority. Here, the authors direct us to Weber, 1921, and 1978, where he argues that authority is what gives power its backing, whereby followers are not forced by leaders to act, rather they are persuaded to accept their demands. In other words, authority is the invisible force that turns raw power into something socially recognized and accepted. Weber goes on to identify 3 types of authority that can legitimize power. The first is traditional authority, where customs and traditions legitimize a leader's power. Think of kings and queens. The second is legal rational authority, where rules and procedures legitimize a leader's power. Think of a CEO of a company. And third is charismatic authority, where extraordinary qualities legitimize a leader's power. Think of a person who just embodies organizational values or is the face of an organization. Or, for you sports fans, think of how Michael Jordan is just synonymous with basketball. All right, now that the authors have given us some cut and dry ways of looking at power and authority, they shift into discussing how power and authority can be subjective and even show up in ways we least expect. Here, the authors ironically use the illustration of a prison design, originally described by Jeremy Bentham, which is known as the panopticon design. Bentham's panopticon prison design features a circular building with an outer ring of prison cells, and in the middle is a central watchtower, which essentially positions the prisoners to be under 24/7 surveillance. Now, this image of the panopticon was later popularized by Michael Foucault, who positioned it as a philosophical concept, suggesting that individuals will regulate their behavior under the fear that they could be watched at any time and therefore punished. I think a really good example of this is right when you walk into a grocery store, you look up and you see that you are being recorded. And while it might not be the only reason, it certainly discourages someone from thinking about stealing, and therefore getting caught, and therefore being punished. Another really good example of this is the recent shift to remote working and digital monitoring. Just knowing that you could be observed at any time probably impacts how you act. And this subtle psychological regulation of behavior is power at work beneath the surface. Okay, with this understanding of how power and authority show up in some obvious and not so obvious ways, the authors lead us into a discussion of how power is at play in politics and how it is connected to leadership. The authors begin their discussion of power, politics, and leadership by differentiating between capital P politics, that of those who are in charge of organizations or even our government, and lowercase p politics, that of organizational politics that happen within an organization, such as everyday interpersonal relationships, or even the idea of politicking. Starting with capital P politics, the authors describe power, politics, and leadership by highlighting how those who are in roles of power and authority in organizations and in the government work from the top down and have the ability to impact individuals, groups, communities, nations, and even the whole world. And here, the authors point out how those who are in roles of power and authority, even outside the government or explicit political positions, are gaining increasingly greater power to impact more people. And a great example of this would be how those who are in charge of social media platforms are often accused of impacting major political and civic movements by allowing their users to influence public opinion and again impact individuals, groups, communities, nations, and even the whole world. Considering lowercase p politics, the authors describe power, politics, and leadership as the internal workings of an organization and identify typical power dynamics within organizations. They do so by highlighting a framework suggested by Fox 1966 and 1974, who describes common power dynamics within organizations through 3 frames of reference. The first is the unitary frame of reference. This operates under the assumption that people in an organization hold shared goals and values and therefore experience minimal conflict. The second is the pluralist frame of reference. This recognizes that an organization holds multiple groups or factions who may have competing interests. And the third is the radical frame of reference. This proposes that an organization experiences 2 classes of employees. The first are those who are high-paid, low-working, and order-giving individuals. The second is the low-paid, high-working, and order-taking individuals. And this power differential often leads to an inherent conflict between these groups due to social inequities. Now, with Fox's frame of references in mind, the authors create an easy segue into their discussion of organizational culture. Organizational culture is often described as, it's just the way things are done here. But a more formal definition, according to Sheen 1992, says that organizational culture is the pattern of shared basic assumptions that the group learned, that has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore to be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. And Sheen goes on to describe organizational culture by defining the roles that, quote, managers and, quote, leaders play in organizational culture. He says that managers live in the culture, but leaders create and alter it. And unfortunately, the authors remind us that not all leaders positively create or alter organizational culture. We've all seen it. Some organizational cultures end up promoting narrow norms, marginalize different or diverse voices, and subsequently create in-groups and out-groups where people develop the mindset that you're either for us or against us. And worse yet, some organizational cultures include inappropriate behaviors and gendered roles that may be subtly or not so subtly enforced. The main point here is this: organizational culture has a lot of power to make or break the people in it. And unfortunately, bad news ahead, the notion of negative organizational culture is not the end of our discussion of poor leadership in this chapter. The authors move from organizational culture to the topic of toxic leadership, the shadow side of leadership. Good leaders are often idealized as rational, reasonable, and even inspirational, whereas the shadow side, toxic leaders, are often described as narcissistic, manipulative, or even abusive, and I'm sure you can think of a ton of other adjectives. And what's interesting, for some reason, toxic leaders have the ability to maintain and exercise power and authority. And this can be described through what is known as charismatic demagoguery. I know, it's a big word. I had to look it up myself. But this means that toxic leaders can appear to be trustworthy and even inspiring on the surface, but in reality, their methods rely on manipulation and division rather than reasoned ethical leadership. And while it is true that toxic leaders are responsible for their own actions, the authors remind us that toxic leadership is not just about one bad apple. Followers, organizational culture, and power structures all play a role. In other words, combating toxic leadership through removing or blaming the person who is in the role of power and authority doesn't solve the deeper issues. Toxicity can become systemic, creating lasting effects that damage the health and performance of the entire organization for years to come. All right, that does it for the main topics of Chapter 6. So now I'm just going to pause and reflect on all of this learning. As I sit with this chapter, a few key takeaways really stand out for me. First, I found it interesting that while power is deeply woven into almost every conversation about leadership, behind the scenes and in reality, it's authority that can legitimize a leader's power. And this draws me closer to the belief that leadership is a social process where leaders and followers co-create their experiences. And even leaders who are in those positions of power and authority, they can only exert force in so much as the followers allow. My second takeaway is I found the panopticon example fascinating. The idea that power doesn't have to be direct or visible, sometimes lurking in the background, shaping what people think, do, or say without them realizing it, that's both powerful and a little unsettling, especially when I think about places of commerce, digital monitoring, and who knows where else. Now, my third takeaway, I gotta be honest, the section on organizational culture and toxic leadership really struck a chord for me. Unfortunately, toxic leadership isn't just some abstract idea in a textbook. We see it every day. We all know that one boss who masquerades as a great guy, supporting their community, doing good, and maybe they even work at a nonprofit. But behind the scenes, you find a person who is padding their own pocket, diminishing diverse voices, disrespecting their spouse, and projecting gendered roles where women are expected to take on subservient roles where their best asset is, well, I better leave that up to your imagination. That's not leadership. It's just hypocrisy wrapped in a mission statement. Okay, end rant. Overall, the big takeaways from Chapter 6 are this. Power, authority, and politics aren't just abstract concepts. They show up in how governments function, how organizations run, and even how people internalize their work culture. And while leaders can inspire and empower, they can also become toxic when power goes unchecked. And if nothing else, this chapter is a great reminder for us to stay critical, reflective, and intentional about the ways we express, experience, and practice leadership. That's it for today's episode. Thanks for listening to Brent's Notepad, where ideas become insight. Until next time, lead better, think deeper, and live more intentionally.